Welcome to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries, where we explore how we proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ in our modern context. Here is your host, pastor and evangelist, Kevin Henry.
Welcome back to the Gospel Activist Podcast. Today on the program, we're going to be beginning a two-part series on the church health component of evangelism. But before we get to that, I want to invite you to subscribe, if you haven't already, to our newsletter so you know when each podcast is uploaded onto our website. Also, there's a place to rate at the bottom, and I'd love to also hear from your comments too and interact with you on this subject. As I mentioned, today's subject is evangelism and how it is a health component of the church. We began in the last two episodes talking about discipleship as a health component of the church, and that there's 5 total that we'll be talking through these coming weeks. But again, today we'll be looking at the topic of evangelism. Evangelism is a very important part of the church. Without it, the church can't grow, because church growth doesn't come from sheep stealing. It comes from new believer growth. It comes from when you share the gospel and the person comes to make a confession of faith and wants to be part of your community of believers and is discipled together. So you can't disciple new people if you don't have people who come to faith. So it's a very important part of church ministry to do evangelism, both individually, but also in the whole context of the church. I want to share with you a quick short story about that. In our church plant that we've started this past summer, we have a group of people that wanted to work together in sharing the gospel. And one person in our church had put together a gospel presentation that took about an hour and a half to present. And we went out to the whole town of Onaway, inviting people to come, and one person came. But when the one person presented the gospel in this presentation, most, if not all, our whole church was there in support of it. And at the end of it, our church went away saying, this should be the way evangelism happens, by us all working together. Yes, there's one who's teaching, and others would comment and add into the conversation, but it was a team effort. And that's really how evangelism should work in the church, being a team effort of the whole church. And that doesn't mean that everyone's going to be up front, but everyone can have a role to play in sharing the gospel as the church together. There are 4 things I want to share with you, 2 of them today, and in the next podcast we'll look at the other 2 things. But these are points that are important for us to remember as the church. So here's the first one. The first is the church's responsibility is to proclaim the gospel. It is the responsibility of the whole church, not just the pastor. It's the responsibility of the whole church to proclaim the gospel. Some people say, well, I don't know what to say, or they're afraid to. Well, get this trained and discipled in evangelism then. There's no excuse for us as Christians not to share the gospel, or at least be equipped and ready to share the gospel when God gives us that opportunity to do so. So again, the first point is the church's responsibility is to proclaim the gospel. In Mark 16:15, we read these words, "Whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, and whoever does not believe will be condemned." Jesus is giving these final words to his disciples before he ascends to heaven, and has given the church the command to go and share the gospel. So we are, as the church, to proclaim the gospel. And the gospel is to be proclaimed verbally. As Romans 10:14 says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they hear without someone preaching?" Well, Paul wrote these words. God inspired him to write these words to remind us that we must speak the words of the gospel. Yes, we can do things that help make it easier to soften people's hearts and minds. By the way, that's God that actually does that. And if we follow his direction for what we do to soften the hearts, remember, it's God at work in their lives. But God calls us to verbally proclaim the gospel. There's a phrase that has been attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, and there's actually no evidence that he actually said this. But the phrase goes like this: to preach the gospel, and if necessary, use words. Well, the truth is, words are necessary. As we've just read from this verse here, how are they to believe on Jesus if they don't hear? And how are they hear if it's not preached? So we're all called as believers to proclaim the gospel verbally, and to do that in the whole context of the whole church together. Yes, it's something we do individually too, but evangelism works so much better when we work together as a whole team, as the church. So that's the first point. The church's responsibility is to proclaim the gospel. The second point now then is the church's responsibility is to go to the lost to proclaim the gospel. We just read moments ago Romans 6:16-15, and it tells us to go. Remember the Great Commission in Matthew 28, to go and make disciples of all nations? We're called to go. We're not just to sit there and wait. We're to go to the lost. Most non-Christians will never darken the doors of the church for whatever reason. That's why we need to go and share the gospel. Some time ago, some of you might remember a movie called The Field of Dreams. And the main character in the movie hears a voice and says, "If you build it, they will come." That's not the case with the church. In the movie, yes, he builds this baseball diamond and these ghosts of baseball legends come out and they play on this baseball field in the middle of a cornfield. But that's not the case with the church. Jesus didn't say, sit and wait for people to come through the doors of your church. If that's the case, you'll be waiting a very long time. Yes, true, God can probably bring some people to the doors of the church to hear the gospel, and he does do that. But the majority of the people won't come to a church. That's why we need to go as we're commanded to go. Don't wait. Just because you have a church building doesn't mean that they're going to come. We need to go to the lost. The church then is sent to proclaim. While we said moments ago we were to verbally proclaim the gospel, the church then too is sent to proclaim. Again, Romans 10:14 and verse 15 added this time says, "How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet to those who preach the good news." In verse 15, it's telling us, if we're not sent to go, how are we going to preach? That's why it's the church's responsibility, it's the pastor's responsibility and the elders of the church to equip the church to proclaim the gospel. And then we're to send each other out to do the work, specifically to go out together to do it. It's important to spend time in prayer as a church, to listen to God's voice for how you are to reach your community for Christ, how you to reach your city or town for Christ. A practice we've been practicing at New Life Christian Community is to spend time listening to God and his voice for his direction. And as we've listened to him for his direction as to how we're to go out to reach our community, every time God has given us a direction for evangelism and we go out, we find that God is softening hearts more and more. And it's getting easier to share the gospel to our community. Our community knows that we're about the gospel. We made that clear from the beginning. But we were also looking for ways in how does God want to use us in our community? And yes, God has been using us to soften our community and to preach the gospel. So we need to listen to God for direction. But then when God gives us the direction to go out and share the gospel, we as the church need to go out, send each other out, go out in teams. Just like Jesus, when he sent out his disciples, he sent them out 2 by 2 into towns and saying, go and proclaim the gospel 2 by 2. God intended us to share the gospel in team, in community. And so we must go out together as a church to share the gospel. So those are the first 2 points for what it means for a church to be healthy in evangelism. Again, the church's responsibility is to proclaim the gospel, And secondly, the church's responsibility is to go to the lost and proclaim the gospel. In our next episode, we'll look at our third point, but also how do we practically go about this, going out as the church to reach the lost. I want to thank you so much for joining us on the program today. And in our next episode, we'll continue our conversation on evangelism. Also, there's a resource that I have for you as a church. It's a little discipleship book here on evangelism. You can find that from our website, steppingoutministries.com. But also, I'm willing to come to your church to help equip your church in evangelism. And so if your church is willing, would like to have someone come in and equip you, you can contact me through the website and we can arrange a time to come and equip your church in how to share the gospel of Jesus Christ. I would love to interact with you on this subject further. So as I said at the beginning of this video, I would love to have your comments at the bottom, but also if you would like to email me, I'd like to be willing to talk with you that way as well. And especially if you have a certain question you'd like to have answered on the program. Until next time, this is Pastor Kevin reminding you to preach the gospel to anyone, anywhere, anytime, and at no matter the cost.
You have been listening to the Gospel Activist Podcast in association with Stepping Out Ministries. To submit a comment or question for Pastor Kevin to answer on the podcast, visit us at www.steppingoutministries.com. Thank you for listening, and we invite you to join us for our next podcast.